I'm now going to hand over to Mennah Abdelwahab to take us on a tour of the rights tracker. So over to you, Mennah.
Thank you so much, Talia. So for part of our conversation today, we want to show you guys how you can access our data, as well as provide a few pointers in terms of understanding the data. So I'm going to start off by sharing my screen. All right. And if you can let me know once you're able to see that. Perfect. So there are a couple of different ways you can get to the rights tracker. The easiest way is just to go to rightstracker.org, but you can also Google HRMI Rights Tracker or go to our humanrightsmeasurement.org website. And from there, you'll see a big button that leads you to the rights tracker. Before we start diving deep into the data, I do want to make note of the fact that the rights tracker is available in a couple of different languages. So if you go up here to the right-hand corner, you can press the downward arrow and click on the language that you are most comfortable working in. For today, we are going to be using English. Now, there are a couple of different ways that you can approach looking at our data. If you're someone who's interested in a specific right or a specific category of rights, you can go to the Rights tab, click on the downward arrow, and click on the right that you're most interested in. This will lead you to a page that provides you data for all the countries for which we have data on that right. If you're interested in a specific country, you can go to the Countries tab, type or scroll down to the country that you're interested in, and this will lead you to a page that has all the data for that country. Finally, if you're interested in a specific group of people and want to understand their experiences, you can click on the People tab, then scroll or type in the name of the people group that you're interested in, and this will lead you to a page that shows you all the countries for which that people group is considered people at risk. To start us off for today, I'm going to be going to the country page for Liberia. So I'm going to go to the Countries tab and then type in Liberia. So when you click on a country, you'll be led to the country page, and the first thing that you'll see is this at a glance page. This at a glance page provides you with a high-level overview of the data that we have for that country. This can be a good way to get a global sense of what type of data we have, but there is a lot more detail that we have to offer. So I recommend that you click through the other tabs. We house our economic and social rights data under the quality of life tab, so that's the tab that I'm going to be going to. The first thing that you may notice when you go to a quality of life page is the summary score. This summary score provides you a general understanding of how the country is performing on the issue of quality of life. It is an aggregate score of all 5 rights that we consider under quality of life, which are the right to education, the right to food, the right to health, the right to housing, and the right to work. Another thing you may notice is the fact that it says % of income adjusted benchmark achieved. So I want to take a moment and just talk about why this is important. As the video mentioned, one of the things that makes HRMI's data unique is that we do consider a country's income when determining its performance on economic and social rights. We do that for 2 reasons. First, because in international law, there is the idea of progressive realization, which means that as countries' level of income improves, we also expect their level of respect for economic and social rights to improve. So international law does tie a country's level of income to its performance on economic and social rights. Another reason why this is really important is that a lot of times governments will say, yes, we could be doing better on the right to education, but if only we had more money. But because our data is considering a country's level of income in terms of assessing its performance on these economic and social rights, you're able to actually say, even with the level of income that you have right now, you're still not doing everything you can. I want to also touch on the fact that for HRMI scores, 100% is achievable. We figure out what 100% is by looking at the highest level of respect we have seen another country within that income bracket achieve. So 100% is an achievable goal because we've seen it happen before, and we expect all countries to get 100% or as close to 100% as possible. Another thing that I want to make note of is the fact of how do you understand these percentages, right? I think a lot of times people look at these percentages as test scores, and that's not exactly the best way to look at these scores. So for example, if you get an 82% or 82.5, so 83% on a test, that's a passing score, right? That's not a bad score. However, I think one of the more useful ways to look at it is to think of it in terms of completion of a task. A really good example that Talia likes to give is if you asked your roommate or your flatmate to do the dishes and they said, oh, absolutely, I will do them, but then they only did 82 or 83% of the dishes, you'd be a little confused and a little upset, right? Because you expected them to do 100%. So anything less than 100% means that the country that we're looking at is not using its resources in the most efficient manner possible and that it's not meeting its obligation under international law. I'm going to keep scrolling down a little bit, but I do want to point out that if you're ever looking at a score and you want to know more information or you're not really sure what that score entails, you can always just click on the score and you'll see that on the right-hand side, more information pops up. It provides you the opportunity to look at how other countries are performing the score, how we define it, etc. So this can be a useful way to get more information if you ever do have questions. We're also happy to answer questions. As we scroll down, we'll see that we have these summary statements. These summary statements provide further context for the scores that we're looking at. For example, you can see that the last statement says that compared with other countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, Liberia is performing worse than average on quality of life rights. So this can be a good place to get more context for the rights you're looking at and could also be a place that leads you to ask more questions and look further into the data. I'm going to scroll down a little bit more and we'll see here we have a portion called Quality of Life Full Details. This is useful information because it allows you to see how a country is performing on a specific right with more detail. So we can see here, for example, for the right to education that Liberia has a score of 35.9. We may be interested to see, why is this? And we see that there are two components that we're considering in the right to education. They are the right to primary education and the right to secondary education. And while Liberia's score on both of these isn't great, we see that it's doing particularly worse on secondary education. So if I was someone working in this field, seeing this may encourage me to figure out ways that we can improve performance on the right to secondary education or just look more into that issue. Scrolling down a little bit more, we will see that we have sex disaggregated data for these rights. I want to take a second and explain what this data tells us. So what this data is doing is that it's comparing Liberia's level of respect for the right to education for its female population to all other countries' level of respect for the right to education for their female populations, given that those countries are in the same income bracket as Liberia. So we're comparing female populations in Liberia and their experience with the right to education to all other females in other countries in a similar income bracket. And we're doing the same for men. We're comparing the level of respect for the right to education for men in Liberia to other countries in a similar income brackets experiences when it comes to the right to education. The reason I think this is important is that sometimes someone may look at the score and say, oh, there are 35% of women in Liberia who are in school. And that's not exactly what this data is trying to tell us. Instead, this data is trying to provide us with the opportunity to understand how Liberia is doing compared to other countries. I'm going to switch over to another country just so that we can get some exposure to another country's data. So I'm going to be going to Angola. And similarly, I'm initially going to land on the at a glance page, and to look more into the economic and social rights data, I'm going to go to the quality of life page. All right, so continuing to scroll down, we see there's the same exact format. We try to make the rights tracker as accessible and easy to navigate as possible. So we try to use the same format across all platforms or all different countries. And for Angola, I'm going to be looking at the overtime data for the right to work. So we do have data on our website that lets you see how a country has been performing in terms of a specific right over time. I was looking at this and I thought Angola's experiences or performance on the right to work was particularly interesting because we see that it did decrease a little bit between 2007 and 2008. And then we see once again that there was even a bigger decrease between 2017 and 2018. I think this data is really interesting, and a lot of times when we're looking for article ideas or just to understand more about a country's experience over time, we look at this overtime data. So I think it's a really interesting and valuable part of the work and of the data that HRMI has to offer, and I definitely encourage people to look more into this overtime data. Finally, I want to talk about a really unique aspect of HRMI's data, which is at the people at risk section. So for all the countries for which we distribute our survey, which is, I think at this point, almost 50 countries, we have people at risk data. So we ask our human rights experts, who are the people in this country that are experiencing or particularly at risk for experiencing a violation of any given right? So we can see, for example, that in Angola, indigenous people are at particular risk for having their right to education violated. The bigger the name and the bolder the name, the more that people group is at risk. You can also take your cursor and put it above that name, and it'll give you the exact percentage. So we see here that 67% of our human rights experts identified indigenous people as being at risk of having this right violated. I do want to point out that just because a group of people is not listed here doesn't mean that they're not at risk at all of facing a violation for a right. It just means that our human rights experts did not identify them as being at particular risk. Finally, I want to scroll down to our qualitative data section. So this is another really unique part of HRMI's work. This is data that's pretty hard to find in terms of other data sources. And this is data that we're getting directly from people who are working and living in the countries that we are providing data for. So here we provide our human rights experts with the opportunity to provide us more detail about the way or the specific people groups that are at risk. So we can see, for example, that students were at risk in Angola for facing a violation of the right to education, specifically because of poor infrastructure and a lack of public services. We also see, for example, that there are specific geographic locations where people are at risk for a violation of the right to education. So overall, this qualitative data is really, really useful, and it's insightful, and it's something that is really unique to the work that HRMI is doing. I want to transition from looking at countries to looking more broadly at rights. And so I'm going to start off by looking at the right to food. To do that, I'm going to take my cursor and go up to rights. And then I'm just going to type in right to food. And when I go to this page, I'm able to see the data of all the countries for which we have data in terms of the right to food. Now, if I was interested in getting a really global view, I could look through all these scores, but if I have a more regional focus, I can apply a country filter. So I'm going to be adding a country filter, and I'm going to be focusing on Sub-Saharan Africa. So one of the first things you may notice is that Gambia has a score of 100%. So I do want to take a minute and explain this. This score does not mean that everyone in Gambia is having their right to food respected. What this does mean is that given its current level of income, Gambia is using its resources in the most efficient manner and achieving the highest possible level of respect for this right. So that doesn't mean that there's no room for improvement, but just means that given its current income, it is doing all it can. Overall, looking per region and overall looking at other countries' scores can be really useful in terms of motivating government actors to care about an issue, right? So you can look at this score and you can say, I live in country X and there's country Y that we consider ourselves comparable to, and they're actually doing a lot better on this right than we are. And that can really be something that motivates government actors or the general populace in a country to care about an issue. I am also going to look at another right. I'm going to look at the right to health. And so to do that, I'm going to go back to rights. I'm going to type in right to health. And once again, being led to a page that gives me all the data for that right, for all the countries for which we have that right. We have that data, excuse me. I'm going to actually remove the Sub-Saharan Africa filter and apply the MENA filter. So I thought this was really interesting. I'm from the region, I'm from Egypt, and so I just wanted to look more into this. And one of the things that I thought was really interesting about this was that Saudi Arabia was considered to be to have the worst score on the right to health compared to all other countries in the MENA region. So I wanted to understand why. And so just through some clicking around, I was able to look at the different aspects that are considered under the right to health. And specifically what I looked at was the right to reproductive health. And scrolling down, found that Saudi Arabia had a score of 14.1, which is absolutely the worst score in the region when it comes to the right to health, specifically the right to reproductive health. So I thought this was really interesting. I would definitely think that Saudi Arabia's low score on the right to reproductive health is contributing to its overall low score on the right to health. And I think doing something like this is really a testament to how useful it can be just to do some clicking around and exploring, asking some questions and looking deeper into the data that HRMI has to offer. There's definitely so much data on the rights tracker that can really help answer a lot of our questions, and in some ways, and a lot of times, lead to even more questions. And so I hope that you will take the time to explore the rights tracker, whether it be a specific country or a specific right that you're interested in. I will add that the rights tracker has so much more information, and we're always happy to answer any questions or provide workshops on the rights tracker in our data. So I hope that this was useful in terms of getting an overview of our data. And now I'm going to hand it over to Eduardo.